I'm Matt Landau from vrmb.com, and this is Unlocked, Season 7, Unglamorous. This episode's brought to you by Point Central, the leaders in smart home automation, and Breezeway, a property care and operations platform that's endorsed organically way too often on this show. Jessica Black is a neighborhood advocate and regional leader of the Texas Neighborhood Coalition. And as a warning, Jessica is not a short-term rental advocate. She's actually on the other side of the argument as a mom against short-term rentals. So you may be wondering, what's she doing on this podcast? Our big mission is to challenge vacation rental leaders to think differently. And you can only learn or think differently so much when hearing the same kinds of profiles all the time. So please don't hate on us for airing this kind of thing at this very pivotal inflection point of our industry's growth. We need people like Jessica with level heads. We need to avoid crazies in order to reach fair conclusions for us all. Let's get into it. Jessica, I would like to begin. Do you remember how we first what happened when we first connected? Do you remember the setup?
Yes, you messaged me on Twitter, and I responded a little nervously because I'd never had a very good interactions with any of the short-term rental operators here locally.
Do you remember what I said at all?
Yes, just that you seem more open than any of the short-term rental operators that I've dealt with here locally, and that you didn't necessarily agree with the property rights argument that seems to be pretty dominant across most of the industry.
I believe I said, don't shoot. I may not have actually said don't shoot, but when you're reaching out to someone who represents moms against short-term rentals, the natural reaction would likely be to shoot. And of course, as I have learned, you don't shoot. And you and I have actually, I wouldn't say we're BFFs, but we've become kind of friends, Twitter friends.
Yes.
And we talk about a lot of stuff. And the flow of information, I think, makes me a better vacation rental professional. And for that reason, I thought it would be neat for us to have a chat here on the Unlocked podcast and share some of the things that we talk about with the broader professional vacation rental audience, who are typically not the people that you are coming in contact with. I think that's worth stating as a disclaimer up front. But would you mind introducing yourself and how you see your role in the vacation rental / short-term rental advocacy sphere?
Sure. So my name is Jessica Black, and I'm in Arlington, Texas, which is right in between Dallas and Fort Worth. My husband and I actually moved back to Arlington when we were pregnant with my oldest daughter because this is where we both grew up and we wanted to be closer to family. I'm currently a stay-at-home mom, but I'm an attorney by education. And I also have an undergraduate degree in government. So when my community started having issues with short-term rentals, I think my background, I really had a strong interest in the legal issues and the public policy issues surrounding all of this. And that's what drove me to get involved, along with just the issues we were having in my neighborhood.
And I think I mentioned to you in one of those first notes that I found the positioning of moms against X to be a very powerful thing. And I think I mentioned to you that the organization that I co-founded in Central America, a gang in demobilization program, was up for a McNulty Prize from the Aspen Institute. And one of the groups that actually won that prize was called Mothers Out Front. And it was basically moms demanding action on climate change. And I really resonated with what a whole bunch of mothers, people whose literal role is caring for humans, what it means when they get together and stand up against or for something that they are concerned about or are rooting for. So Moms Against Short-Term Rentals, is that still your operating group title?
When we started organizing at the local level here in my city, we had had a decades old ordinance on the books that prohibited short rentals less than 30 days. And it was really a group of moms that were organizing because we weren't comfortable letting our kids go play in the neighborhoods anymore. We felt like we were losing our sense of community. Um, but beyond that local level, a lot of my work, especially currently, has been with a group called the Texas Neighborhood Coalition, and that is a statewide group here in Texas that's neighbors from cities across the state that are really working on issues surrounding preserving local control of land use and zoning and short-term rental regulations, as well as working with residents in cities that maybe haven't regulated yet and are having issues to educate them on what's the current case law in Texas regarding short-term rental regulations. What have other cities done? What's worked well? What hasn't worked well? So it, my position is more nuanced. Here at the local level, we wanted our ordinance that was already on the books that we relied on when we bought our homes and enforced. But on the bigger picture, and I know I've mentioned this to you, Matt, my parents owned a vacation rental for 25 years in the Florida Panhandle. I think that there's a time and a place for them, but I think that local communities should have the right to decide where they work, how they work, what other considerations are going on in the community that need to be taken into account and balanced so that short-term rentals are a good thing versus a bad thing.
I want to touch on local and statewide in a little bit. But first, I'm just curious because we featured you a number of times in season 1 of How to Save Your Vacation Rental Business podcast, hosted by Dana Lubner. Listeners, if you haven't heard that 10-part series, it's absolutely amazing on all your podcast channels. And we're just getting ready to launch season 2 of that show. But I'd like for you, Jessica, to explain some of the actual neighborhood change that prompted you to be really concerned, because I don't think everybody on this podcast channel is aware of that.
I guess what prompted us to organize is what you seem to see at the city council meetings everywhere, and what was happening in our city were the complaints about the party houses, and then the short-term rental operators saying, well, if we could just shut down the party houses, everything would be great. And as a mom, I don't necessarily agree with that, because for me, it's beyond that. It's wanting to know my neighbors. It's wanting to feel safe letting my kids go out in the community. And when you have what really is a commercial business, that you don't have residential neighbors living in it, it changes the structure of the community. There's sex offender laws that don't apply to people that aren't legal residents. There's just how do you do a neighborhood crime watch group? Because the whole idea of a crime watch group is you get to know your neighbors, you get to know their routines and their cars, and everybody looks out for something that's out of the ordinary. Well, the entire purpose of a short-term rental is to bring a constant flow of strangers into the community. That makes that impossible. Something that really drove home what community means and what we felt like we were losing being here in Texas was the February freeze this past year, when we were all stuck in our houses and nobody had power and nobody had water. And it was neighbors looking out for each other, loaning each other firewood, somebody with a 4x4 driving to the store. I was next door helping my elderly neighbors with their pool equipment. And when you don't know your neighbors, when you don't have neighbors, you don't have that.
One part of it, if I'm getting this right, was a loss of sense of community. Another part of it was actual concerns for the well-being, like of your children, for instance. If I remember correctly, your children would be waiting for the bus, and who knows who's in that house in front of them, right?
Well, the first thing I did when I found out that we had short-term rentals operating in my neighborhood was, go to Airbnb's website and start looking up, okay, what kind of vetting do they do? And when you dig into the fine print, it'll tell you that they can't guarantee users or who they claim to be. They can't guarantee that they've verified the ID, run a background, that somebody doesn't have a criminal record, that they're not on a sex offender registry. And you're like, oh my gosh, do we want kids in the neighborhood standing out on the bus stop when we've got these businesses operating? Because you don't know. And the same is true of hotels. They don't necessarily vet all their guests, but hotels aren't operating in residential neighborhoods. And I would think it's fair to say that if you go to a hotel, you've kind of got your guard up at a certain level, because you know that it's very transient and you don't necessarily know who's there. But if it's your neighborhood where you're trying to raise your kids and it's supposed to be your safe place, nobody wants to live on that level of high alert constantly.
So I mentioned to you that I wanted to share this story live on the air, but I'm now a resident of South Beach. I moved here last year, kind of in the peak of the pandemic. And South Beach is a famously touristy place, and there's a whole district dedicated to hotels and bars and stuff. I happen to live in a much more residential side of South Beach, where it's mostly families who have lived there for many years. Nice big trees, wide streets, and it really had this feeling of a neighborhood, of community that I was just really impressed by. And semi recently, I started noticing some craziness beginning to drip into the neighborhood, whether it was people just completely wasted, clearly not from there, making a complete scene in odd hours of the evening. Or, and this was the one that really got me, I was getting ready to get into an Uber, and before I crossed the street, I looked up and there was a car that went flying from one side of the neighborhood to the other with not even stopping at any of the intersections, probably 50 or 60 miles an hour. And I was just froze dead in my tracks, because if I hadn't looked up, I would have gotten hit by that car for sure. And I happened to see another neighbor right there, and I was like, what the was that? And she said, it's been happening a lot lately. And this was a very unsettling thing for me. I literally was shaking in the Uber there. I was like, I could have just died. And fast forward a couple months, I get shown this landing page, this advertisement. I think it was on Facebook or Instagram, that said, do you live in South Beach? Are you concerned about visitors flying down the neighborhood streets at 60-mile an hour, in some cases through the stop signs? Sign up here, because there are illegal condo hotels that have been facilitating this behavior. And Jessica, you'd be very proud of me. I signed up because, I mean, the messaging spoke exactly to my well-being. And my first question, because I now am fully aware of what it means to live in a place where there's potentially bad behavior, how would you differentiate that bad behavior between the hotels that we are aware exist in South Beach versus me signing an anti-vacation rental bill claiming that several of the buildings are illegally run as hotels? Like, is there a way to distinguish the difference there, or did I kind of lump everything together?
In my mind, this is where zoning comes into play, because there's actually a tourism policing expert here in Texas. He's a former Texas A&M professor that I guess does consulting work now. And I've read some of his research, and it touches on how lowered inhibitions is it's something that runs through every aspect of tourism policing. And lowered inhibitions might be speeding and not paying attention to traffic signs. It might be staying up a little bit later and having an extra drink or two than you normally would, and letting a few more F-bombs fly. But it could go, much further to the extreme in terms of drug use and the parties and the shootings and some of the other stuff we've seen. But I just think when someone is on vacation and they're in a new environment and they know they're never going to see these people again, people just kind of let their freak flag fly a little bit more than they would in their normal life. And so I think as long as you're putting the tourism industry in residential neighborhoods, that friction is going to be there. You're just fighting human nature.
Were you referring to me about the F-bombs?
No.
Okay, thank you. My inhibitions are lowered right now. So I want to move into why this is important for people listening. And I want to give this brief story. Sarah Bradford, another podcast host in our industry, she's got her big vacation rental management enterprise in Steamboat Springs. And a number of years ago, when we were talking about advocacy, she said to me, and we've joked since, she said, I don't have to worry about advocacy because our destination is touristy. Like, we're built, the economy is built on the backs of the vacation rental sector. Fast forward to last weekend, we were together at Amy Hinote's Data and Revenue Management Conference in Charleston. And Sarah was attending virtually a city council meeting because they were threatening to basically make illegal a decent chunk of the inventory on the market in Steamboat Springs. And she sort of um, never saw it coming. And the funniest part is that in that conversation, her fellow podcast host, Tim Cafferty, who's in the Outer Banks, sort of comically said, "We don't have to worry about in our destination. We're different because we're very touristy." So my question for you is, do you think that this kind of regulation, no matter the destination, is coming to a city near you?
I think the exponential growth of the industry is prompting it in some of those locations you mentioned that are traditional vacation rental markets. Like here in Texas, for example, I'm familiar with a lot of the issues that are going on in Port Aransas. Port Aransas has gone from about 1,000 short-term rentals in 2010 to 5,000 now. And this is an island that has one bridge and a ferry to get over there. So that community is experiencing issues with traffic because it's hard to get on and off the island. They're experiencing issues with trash pickup because the trash trucks have to come across the bridges, and there's just so much more trash that they're having problems keeping up. Um, it's a community that has already had to bus students in from surrounding school districts to keep their schools open. And as more and more of the residents are priced out and can't live on the island, they're having to do more of that to keep schools open. There's also businesses that are having issues finding employees because, like I said, it's a hassle to get there with the bridge and the ferry, and people can't afford to live on the island anymore, and nobody wants to take an hour ferry ride to get to a minimum wage job on the island. So there's issues that can come into play when the industry grows too big too fast. And I think you and I have talked a little bit about, when I think about sustainability, that's what sustainability is to me. Because if schools are shutting down and businesses can't operate because they don't have employees, that becomes an issue long term.
Yeah, well put. And if you were somehow magically with me when Sarah Bradford said, "This won't happen in my destination because we're based on tourism," what, what you know now, advice would you have given to her to get a proactive jump on this?
Well, my city is a tourism city. We've got the Cowboy Stadium, the Texas Ranger Stadium. We've got Six Flags Over Texas. We've got a water park. So tourism is a huge part of our economy. But I've never felt like being a tourist city means that you have to turn your entire city into Disneyland. You should still be able to have residential communities and enough housing for the people that live there. So it's really about sitting down with the local community and making some value choices about what works, how much can you sustain in terms of short-term rentals and still have balance and quality of life for the people that actually live there. I always laugh though when people, because in the media, people will say that what my city did was ban short-term rentals. So in preparation for this call, I actually went back through my notes. We have 4,927 single-family parcels in my city that are eligible to be short-term rentals, and if you include like townhomes, duplexes, there's 11,971. And I'm like, how could we have that many properties that are eligible to be short-term rentals and have it be considered a ban? So it's not, maybe you can't do them everywhere in the city that a short-term rental operator would want to, but we certainly have plenty of opportunities for them. It's about figuring out where they make sense.
So then is the advice to Sarah, begin thinking about these things that you have never thought about before?
Probably. I mean, like you need to have the workforce housing. You need to have places for people that actually want to live in communities and don't want to be surrounded by commercial businesses 24/7. And having grown up, I cut my teeth working in restaurants. When you work in the hospitality industry, you don't want to come home to the hospitality industry. You want to be able to come home and relax. And if the hospitality industry is next door, that's going to get old pretty quick.
And I think taking into account your point about how quickly the vacation rental industry has grown as a result of companies like Airbnb, these are all in a lot of cases new dynamics that we need to take into consideration, like there's the increased demand, but there's also all these other increased stresses on what were otherwise pretty sustainable neighborhood setups, right?
Mm-hmm.
After the last season of our podcast, Jessica, I want to give you credit. You said, you guys keep saying we want fair regulation. We want fair regulation. What is fair regulation to you? And I said, let me get back to you on that. And I actually think I said, can we have a podcast discussion about this? And it is the theme of season 2 of the How to Save Your Vacation Rental Business podcast. Fair regulation. What is it? So I'm curious, what is fair to you from your perspective, from where you currently sit?
I think fair is going to differ from location to location. And for that, I go back to my own experience, comparing where my parents owned their vacation rental versus my, suburban residential neighborhood. So where my parents had theirs, it was a barrier island. It had pretty much always been second homes and vacation rentals since probably the 50s or 60s when things first started getting built there. In fact, my dad found out about it because one of his coworkers used to go party there when he was in college. So I don't think anybody who bought a home on that island would have been surprised if they ended up next to a vacation rental, which is a very different situation than, say, my neighborhood, where it's a neighborhood, most of the neighborhoods in my city were built the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. They've always been residential. They're established communities. Nobody here bought their home expecting that you're suddenly going to become surrounded by short-term vacation rentals. So, that's one thing, just kind of what has been the status quo in that area. And then beyond that, I think communities just have to look at things like, what are the potential benefits of the short-term rentals, whether it's hot tax or a sales tax revenue that the tourists bring in, looking at existing hotel capacity. What is the local housing market like? What is the need for workforce housing like? And the impact on non-tourism businesses. Because I hear a lot of arguments sometimes about, oh, this is great. We bring so much business to local businesses. But then I think about the kinds of businesses that tourists frequent, and that isn't going to be your doctors or your dentists or your car washes or a lot of other types of local businesses. So looking at that, looking at the infrastructure, some of the issues I mentioned that are going on in Port Aransas, looking at the safety issues for guests and for residents. And then another big one is the cost of short-term rental enforcement, because here in Texas, that's a big problem for us, because under state law, the local hotel occupancy taxes can only be used to promote tourism. So anything as far as enforcement has to come out of the general fund, which is being funded by all the local residents. And I personally have concerns because I'm like, not only am I having to give up, being asked to give up my residential zoning that I relied on when I bought my home, but I'm being asked to foot the bill to police these things, and I'm not getting any benefit out of it. So that really never seemed fair to me. You know, looking at the ability to enforce whatever regulations are enacted, and some of it is just a value judgment, looking at what is the highest use of property. And an example that I think you and I tweeted about one time was a park. Like, a park is not going to generate any revenue. In fact, it's probably going to lose the city revenue because they have to maintain it, because they can't put commercial businesses there that generate sales tax. But that might be the highest and best use of that property in terms of the citizens' quality of life. So those are all things that I think kind of go into this conversation, looking at what's fair and what makes sense for each community.
And you kind of hinted at this, but who to you are the stakeholders that get to be at this table to determine what's fair?
Well, I mean, I think definitely all the parties need to be there, but I think, I'd love to see the platforms get more involved.
Oh my God, yes.
I think, and you and I have talked about this, it's a struggle. A lot of regulations target the hosts or the guests, but there's another party to the transaction that's not being held accountable. So,
That's way bigger and richer and more powerful.
yes. So, it's not that the host can have a voice, the city management, because obviously, like I said, they have to figure out what they can pay to enforce and what resources they have, and then the residents. But one thing that does work in the residents' favor is that you don't get to vote unless you live there.
And so, does that mean that somebody who gets to vote because they live there has more weight when attending a meeting with, say, somebody who just happens to rent a business space?
Well, I think city council members or politicians, and I think just by virtue of that, um, there's a risk at not listening to the voices that are going to go to the poll on election day and pull the lever.
And I would also remind anybody listening to use this as an excuse to make sure you're connected with the homeowners that you're working with. And if they do technically live there, if it's their vote that counts, making sure that they're engaged is potentially a game changer. If they're not going to vote, there's a reason why it's it's leaning one way or another. And I'm curious, Jessica, with your community's stakeholders, are you guys close to finding something fair, and what does that look like?
So our ordinance was passed in 2019, and what it did was, so you can do short-term rentals in any zoning classification throughout the city that is mixed use, commercial, multifamily. If you want to do a short-term rental in a single family residential zone, they carved out what's called the STR zone, which is a 1 mile radius around our entertainment district where all the stadiums are. And then any single family residential neighborhoods beyond that zone, they're not allowed. But like I said, there's 4,927 single family properties throughout the city that can operate as short-term rentals. Only 881 of those are actually in that STR zone. So there's still a fair number of single family properties that through the course of, my city's growth, maybe they were once in a residential area and then things have grown and changed and they're now in a mixed use neighborhood, or they're now kind of downtown in the central business district. And those properties are all eligible to operate as short-term rentals. It's just anything outside that entertainment district area that's single family is for the residents that live here, so that they can have neighbors, so that they can have peace and quiet, so that they can have community.
And I'm guessing that the people who don't fall into those permitted properties, they're going to be very unhappy with whatever this resolution was. But I'm thinking about that phrase, a good compromise is one in which both parties are unhappy. I'm curious, do you think that applies to destinations around the country?
I mean, I think, with compromise, there's always going to be something that somebody wishes they got that they didn't. I'm trying to remember what community it was recently. Was it Chelan County there was another community where they made some compromises where they're going to grandfather in the ones that were there, and that they put some occupancy limits on that they weren't crazy about, but they felt like it was the best they can get.
And now, a word from our sponsors. We actually have our sponsors on the line, our fearless supporters in Point Central and Breezeway. I'd like to get started with Sean Miller, the president of Point Central. When looking at the safety of a vacation rental management organization, how does Point Central fit into that preventative strategy?
For us, safety is one of those things we see property managers. This isn't something you optionally provide. This is something that is just sort of always there, always evolving, and is just part of the guest's expectations. So for us, safety started around keyless, right? There was concerns before when you think of a mechanical key, again, how keys can get lost and duplicated. There's the risk there that those keys would be nefariously used. And so by moving to a keyless lock system with event history and other things, property managers could ensure that the right person only enters the home at the right time. And then things have evolved from there. So you can think of health has become a really big part of people's mental space for safety. So things on our end there of humidity monitoring or leak detecting that help make sure mold growth doesn't happen. We've seen be important to the overall safety. And then even as simple or as probably common as monitored life safety services. So Point Central with our as being a part of our parent company, alarm.com, we have the ability to offer monitored fire and security services so that owners and property managers who want to provide a full monitored package can make sure that whether the home is occupied and a guest is in it, or the home is unoccupied and they just want to make sure it stays safe when no one's there, that they can do that and provide those services to their owners and their guests.
Jeremy, when safety comes up as a topic with property managers using Breezeway as a core piece of their technology stack, what ways are they addressing and avoiding any safety risks?
4 quick points on safety. The first is cleaning and making sure that when the properties are being cleaned and turned over, made ready for the next guest, that all the right parts of that job are being done and touched, and making sure that you have good records and understanding of the work that's being done to prepare that property. Same thing with inspections on point 2, making sure that you're actually going through the property on a routine basis, checking and making sure you understand the condition, or the folks that are working with you, contractors or your staff, are doing that and actually going through the properties. 3 is setting up recurring maintenance. We all typically work with unique properties that are all different, and making sure that you're hitting all the right preventative maintenance so that you can stay ahead of it, provide a safe quality experience for your guests. It's paramount. And on the 4th, at Breezeway, we do a lot with safety training. We work with Justin Ford, national expert on vacation rental safety, to help train property managers, our clients, and in the industry around safety and what they should be looking for, whether it's tripping hazards, fire and health safety, just to make sure we all want the same thing, right? Great experiences in the property.
I like the grandfathering because it almost rewards the vacation rental professionals, like the people who are listening here, for stepping up and participating in some kind of fair regulation without too much cost, as opposed in setting some kind of precedent for vacation rental professionals of the future. Is that grandfathered solution something that you like too?
I don't know if I would have liked it for my my community, but I've seen others do it. And we're a little different because, like I said, we had an ordinance on the books that clearly prohibited rentals of less than 30 days. So I don't know if I wanted to grandfather people that were operating in defiance of the law. But like College Station, we did help them work through their ordinance process, and that's the route that they decided to go. So they went ahead and grandfathered anybody that was operating as of the date the ordinance passed, but you can't transfer those permits when you go to sell the property, and you can't get new permits in single family residential zones. And that's just to kind of stop the takeover, I guess. It stops those neighborhoods from being completely overrun, because they were having issues there with game day houses, because a lot of people come to town for football games, and so instead of neighbors, you had basically frat parties rolling in on the weekends.
I'm curious, like if you can put your family vacation rental panhandle hat on for a second. On the OTA topic, what would you as a vacation rental professional expect the OTAs that are making money off of our craft to do in terms of coming to some sort of fair regulation?
Well, lots of things. One big beef I have is them kind of, when they don't get their way in a local community, going to the state and trying to preempt it. But on a basic, more local level, just enforcing local regulations, not turning a blind eye when they know that somebody's operating an illegal short-term rental. I know there's a woman in Galveston who's having huge issues down there. She's actually a short-term rental operator. And Airbnb claims that their max occupancy right now is 16 people because of the pandemic. And she keeps contacting them because there's all these short-term rentals in Galveston that are advertising on Airbnb that sleep 40 people, and they're causing all sorts of issues in Galveston. And the city council's wanting to come down and do more strict regulations, and she's blaming Airbnb because they're not enforcing their own rules.
So is that like, is the tip here, as a responsible vacation rental professional, you kind of need to get the OTAs on top of the risks to your business of these bad apples?
Well, I mean, I think absolutely they could do more in terms of vetting. They could do more in terms of enforcing their own rules and policies, because they don't seem to do a very good job of that. More safeguards to keep somebody who's gotten banned from just setting up a new account and booking another house and creating problems somewhere else. So there's lots of opportunities for them to step in. I think back to when my parents were doing it and how it's changed because of Airbnb and VRBO. The island where my parents are, there's no such thing as a rental of less than a week. It's just unheard of. In fact, my brother was laughing because some of his friends were trying to book places there, and they're like, I can't get anything less than a week. And my brother's like, yeah, I know. It's always been that way there because they can. You go to a local property management company. They check your ID. They match the name on the ID to the credit card. You sign a contract. There's a deposit, hold on the credit card. You meet somebody in person and get the keys. They're there to kind of drive by occasionally and make sure that nothing crazy is going on. So when this all goes to an anonymous online platform, you lose so much of that. And I think that's where a lot of the problems come from. Because in 25 years of my parents having that house, we never had any of the issues that you hear about now. Our biggest issue was when somebody came in town for a big family reunion and they rented our unit and maybe the unit next door, and our pots and pans would migrate. That was the biggest problem I can remember.
I like the way you phrased that. Just envisioning the pots walking down the street. Give us your thoughts on the difference between local solutions versus statewide preemptions, because you and I share this, and on average with the big players in vacation rentals, I think we are on the opposite side of them.
Well, I think land use and zoning have always traditionally been matters of local jurisdiction. And so, for instance, what my community came up with that has worked very well for us. In fact, we even have short-term rental operators that come out and campaign for the city council members that help pass it now because they realize that it works. It gives them certainty. It gives the residents certainty. Is not something that state legislators who have never been to my city, who don't know our neighborhoods, who don't know our community, could have come up with. In fact, when there was a preemption bill in 2019, it would have allowed, I think it was like 1 in every 8 homes to become a full-time investor-owned short-term rental. And there's nothing that cities could have done to prevent it. And I look at that and I'm like, how many cities are there in our state that could afford to lose 1 in 8 homes? It was like 12.5% of their residential housing stock, and not have that have a huge impact on the people that actually live there. So I think that the solutions are going to be so different. What works in Galveston and Port Aransas isn't going to work in College Station or Arlington. There's so much nuance to getting it right that you just can't do it with a broad brush. And usually the preemption laws are the short-term rental industry, the Airbnb and VRBO coming in with money and power and influence and wanting to handcuff the cities so that they can pretty much roll over them.
So if on the voting machine was the option to ban short-term rentals throughout Texas, would you click yes or no?
No. I mean, like I said, there's cities like Port Aransas and Galveston, and where it's a huge part of their economy. And even here in Arlington, we've found a way to make them work.
Folks, I think this deserves a quick call out. It's something I actually learned from sociologists when I was back working with at-risk youth. And when you're trying to get something that you want, It helps to listen to the opposing viewpoint and to actually embrace it, like for a couple minutes. Say it out loud. Fully internalize the opposing opinion. By the time the exercise is over, you've equipped yourself with a new angle, a new perspective to use in your own pursuits. And this isn't just for vacation rentals, by the way. It works for anything. Okay, let's continue.
I don't think it's that short-term rentals are necessarily good or bad. I think it's about when you have a right thing in a wrong place, it can become bad. So communities need to be able to figure out what is the right place and how does this work for our community in light of all those other considerations that I mentioned earlier.
I was kind of expecting you to say that, but I was also wondering if you might just say, absolutely, I would vote for that.
Well, like I said, my parents did this for 25 years. It was different then, though. I've been thinking a lot about what it was like what Airbnb has brought to it is a lot of either on the smaller operator side, the amateurs that think this is the new get rich quick thing and don't know how to vet guests and don't necessarily know what they're doing. And then on the other end, it's brought in a lot of the large scale players. Like there's a company called Realpha that I guess has their eyes on Dallas. They already have 40 short-term rentals there, and their goal is to have at least 100 properties in every city that they operate in so that they can achieve economies of scale. So when you have huge companies coming in and taking hundreds of houses off the market, that's a problem too. When my parents did it, it was mainly people that wanted to have a vacation home but were looking for a way to offset some of the costs. Nobody was doing it to get rich quick. In fact, I would think with all the hurricanes that came through, my parents probably lost money. But it was just a way to defray some of the costs of having a second vacation home. It wasn't a business necessarily.
And part of what I love about our thought partnership is the level-headedness and the fact that you answer those questions that way. And on the opposite end of the level-headedness spectrum are psychos. There's people who just aren't level-headed at all, extreme on one side or another. How do you recommend listeners who are most certainly not in your destination, otherwise they'd be reaching out to you, find level-headed people as part of the discussion?
It's hard. I've been to city council meetings where I'm sitting next to a neighbor who is just so fed up that she's, mumbling not nice things under her breath the whole meeting, and I'm elbowing her saying, just shut up. This isn't helping. And it's hard because I get that on one side, you have people that feel like their businesses are at stake. And on the other side, you have people that feel like their homes and communities are at stake. And so those are things that people tend to be pretty passionate about. I guess because of my background with the law, and that just lends me to kind of, I look at issues and compromises and solutions and try not to let my passions overtake that. But it's hard.
And I think you also do a really good job of getting data and finding actual facts that can be used in one argument or another, but at least you're starting with a common language, right?
Well, I think getting data is huge, but getting data in this argument's always been a challenge because the short-term rental platforms hold most of the data and they don't want to share it. So you have to either, go to sites that scrape the platforms, or I have a list of shootings I've been keeping for 2 years. You have to make the data yourself, and just that takes a lot of work. So it's hard to get good data.
I think we've kind of agreed on this phrase disruptive technology as being both a good and a bad thing. It's good when it's changing paradigms and improving people's lives. It's bad when it's literally disrupting your ability to sleep at night. Can you share a little bit about precedent, like companies or disruptive technologies in the past that you think are good examples worth considering?
I think I know what you want me to say here. Well, you and I have talked about Napster, and I sometimes I took a class in law school that was on emerging technology. And back then it was, to date myself, it was Napster that we were talking about. Um, but Napster was something that came about. It was really popular because everybody loved getting free music files. Um, and they thought that was great, but it wasn't so great for the record companies and the artists that were having their intellectual property rights infringed. And that kind of gave way, um, through litigation and to some of the music sharing platforms we have now that are, you pay for the service or you pay to download the record, um, that are more protective of everyone's rights. And I would hope that the short-term rental industry goes that way as well.
For the record, that was what I was hoping you were going to say. But I'm also curious if you can apply either the similarities or the differences with Uber.
Uber, well, I mean, obviously they get compared a lot, but and while there's obviously issues with Uber, to me, what's going on with the short-term rentals is almost different in the sense that it's next door. You can't get away from it.
And I would view Amazon in a similar way. Like, it's, yes, changing the way people buy and enjoy products that they like. But, well, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, Amazon has effectively killed the mom and pop shop. How do you view Amazon through this lens?
All of these things have, impacts. Like I said, they catch on because they're convenient and people like them, but they have unintended consequences. And I think some of what's going on with the short-term rental industry is part of a bigger trend of the financialization of housing, whether that's, all the stories you see about BlackRock buying up homes to rent them. Or, like I said, that company Realpha that's buying up hundreds of homes to turn them into short-term rentals. And that's something that I think as a society we have to think about. Like, is this good for us long term? Because are my kids going to be able to buy a house if we keep going this way? I don't know.
Sometimes I think to myself, the argument against short-term rentals because they're infringing on affordable housing is actually an argument against development and just general gentrification. Are they mutually exclusive, those two deals?
I don't think so. What I've seen in just paying attention to articles and some is that in a lot of cities where short-term rentals have taken off, I think Vancouver and Toronto are two cities where I've seen a lot of this mentioned, is that the stuff that gets built becomes things that are basically designed to become short-term rentals. So yes, I think sometimes it's the same people that are opposed to both, but if you have housing that's being built and it's immediately being converted to short-term rentals at a faster rate than the housing can be built, you're never going to dig yourself out of the hole.
And this is kind of like an awkward question that I've been wanting to ask you, and please forgive me if it comes off even worse than I intended. But you moved to your neighborhood when?
We bought this home in 2014.
Okay. So what do you say to a new, let's just say, wave of home owners, home buyers in your destination, claiming a different kind of ownership in the community than perhaps your predecessors, the people who lived there before you?
What do you mean by different kind of ownership?
Does that sequence, so let's say there's somebody who owns the house next to you who's actually been there for uh, 15 years longer than you, and they think vacation rentals on the block are a good thing. Is there something about the timing of when you came into the equation that's relevant, or should it just be built into the principles of any given street or neighborhood, do you think?
I think most cities have established processes that for any type of a zoning change. So if you buy a piece of property and it's zoned a particular way with a particular set of rules, if there's to be a change to those, they need to go through the public processes versus a short-term rental operator unilaterally deciding, hey, this is a mixed use neighborhood now. because you've got the reliance interest of every other homeowner who bought based what was on the books. So if what's on the books is going to change, that needs to go through a public process to decide if that's what the community wants.
Okay, fair. You always have the answers. Jessica, do you have any big wish for the vacation rental movement?
Like I said, a lot of what I've been focused on and most familiar with is here in Texas. And it would be to get away from the attempts to pass preemption laws, because that just makes me go crazy. Although I stay calm, it makes me feel crazy. Let me say that. Um, and the bad apple argument, that, if we could just get rid of the bad apples, it would be great, because I've been watching what's been going on in Dallas, for instance, and that seems to be kind of the common narrative. And I feel like they're not listening to the neighbors that are saying, whether it's a good apple or a bad apple, it's a commercial apple. And digging into, like I said, some of those deeper issues about community and what are the costs to police this, and what are the costs in terms of quality of life or loss of housing or other needs that the community has, to really see maybe there are places that short-term rentals make sense, but maybe get away from the idea that it has to be everywhere.
My hope is that this interview can add a little bit of texture, a little nuance to your habits about advocacy. And Jessica, by the way, how can listeners reach out to you?
My Twitter handle is at JJ Sheedy, Sheedy, like Ali Sheedy, the actress.
Perfect. Listeners, don't shoot. And folks, as part of the goal to challenge you to think differently, we're following Jessica's interview this week with an absolute zinger on the complete opposite end of the spectrum next week, when we interview Matt Roberts, the CEO of Vacasa, to talk about all kinds of things, including his really nice hair. The Matt versus Matt interview will likely be another one that you don't entirely agree with, but that's okay. That's good. Knowing what all the stakeholders in your equation are thinking is an important step to being a better pro. And I don't think I'll ever say this again, but neither Jessica nor Matt Roberts are paying members of VRMB's private forum. But if you appreciate our style of problem solving, or any tips that you've gleaned over the years, please come and join nearly 1,000 of the most thoughtful vacation rental owners and managers in the world, all under one virtual roof. For a monthly fee, we help you build a meaningful vacation rental brand. You can sign up at vrmb.com/join. Price goes up next week.